Vatican City, September 17, 2025. The solemn setting of St. Peter's Square was once again filled with silence, anticipation and reflection as Pope Leo XIV addressed thousands of faithful during his weekly general audience. But this was no ordinary catechesis. The pontiff, visibly moved, chose to focus his remarks almost entirely on the ongoing crisis in Gaza, denouncing what he described as the forced removal of civilians and the suffering endured by the Palestinian people. At the heart of his words was a moral appeal that transcended politics and borders. Looking out over the crowd, Pope Leo XIV paused before delivering a statement that resonated not only in the Vatican but across capitals around the globe. He said, "I express my deep solidarity with the Palestinian people in Gaza who continue to live in fear and endure unacceptable conditions, forced once again to leave their lands. Before the Almighty Lord who commanded, 'Thou shalt not kill,' and in the presence of all human history, every person always has an inviolable dignity to respect and preserve. I renew the call for a ceasefire, the release of hostages, a negotiated diplomatic solution, and full respect for international humanitarian law. I invite everyone to join my heartfelt prayer so that a dawn of peace and justice may soon rise." Those words, delivered with a steady yet sorrowful tone, echoed the Pope's long-standing commitment to defending human dignity. The Vatican later confirmed that the pontiff had been briefed extensively on the worsening humanitarian conditions inside Gaza. This was not the first time Pope Leo XIV raised his voice in defense of Palestinians. Since the beginning of the latest escalation earlier this year, he has consistently framed the suffering of Gaza's civilians as a moral test for the world community. His previous calls for restraint, humanitarian corridors and peace negotiations have often been overshadowed by the sound of rockets and the thunder of bombardments. But Wednesday's message carried added urgency, suggesting that the Vatican sees the current situation as spiraling toward what it fears could be irreversible devastation. Observers noted that his phrase, "forced once again to leave their lands," was particularly striking. It not only acknowledged the immediate displacement caused by military operations, but also evoked the deep historical trauma of repeated expulsions faced by Palestinians since 1948. While the Vatican insists the Pope does not take political sides, his moral interventions often carry political weight. His invocation of the biblical commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," placed the violence in Gaza within a universal religious framework, one that challenges leaders on all sides. Equally, his insistence that every person always has an inviolable dignity to respect and preserve was widely interpreted as a rebuke to the dehumanizing language that too often surrounds discussions of the Gaza conflict. The Pope's fourfold appeal, ceasefire, release of hostages, diplomatic negotiations, and respect for international humanitarian law, mirrors the very demands made by the United Nations and humanitarian organizations, giving his words a resonance far beyond Vatican walls. The immediate reaction to his statement rippled across international media. Al Jazeera broadcasted excerpts of the Pope's speech with Arabic subtitles, while Italian outlets highlighted his decision to switch momentarily into his native tongue. "Esprimo la mia profonda vicinanza al popolo palestinese," a gesture that gave his words emotional intimacy. Diplomatic observers in Rome suggested the Vatican may be preparing to play a more active mediating role, especially as traditional peacemaking efforts stall. While the Holy See does not wield military or economic power, it has historically served as a moral bridge in conflicts, from Latin America's dirty wars to the fall of the Iron Curtain. Behind the Pope's appeal lies a grim reality. Gaza, a densely populated strip of land home to over 2 million people, has faced repeated cycles of war, blockade, and internal political divisions. In recent months, military escalations have forced tens of thousands of families to flee their homes, often seeking refuge in overcrowded shelters or makeshift camps. Aid agencies describe shortages of water, medicine, and electricity, compounded by the destruction of civilian infrastructure. It is against this backdrop that Pope Leo XIV's reference to unacceptable conditions gains weight. Vatican sources confirmed that he has been receiving daily reports from Catholic aid groups working in Gaza, including updates on schools, hospitals, and parishes directly affected by the conflict. Since his election to the papacy, Pope Leo XIV has made peacebuilding a cornerstone of his mission. Analysts note that his weekly audiences have increasingly become platforms for urgent appeals rather than purely theological reflections. Over the past year, he has spoken out on Ukraine, Sudan, Myanmar, and now Gaza, always framing war as a betrayal of human dignity. This week, however, his words seemed more personal, perhaps even desperate. Vatican aides said the Pope spent hours in private prayer the night before the address, consulting scriptural texts on justice and mercy. His decision to emphasize prayer, "I invite everyone to join my heartfelt prayer so that a dawn of peace and justice may soon rise," was both a spiritual appeal and a diplomatic signal. Change must come not only through politics, but through a transformation of hearts. The significance of the Pope's remarks lies also in their universality. Gaza is home to a small but ancient Christian community, yet his solidarity extended well beyond co-religionists. Muslim leaders, too, have historically acknowledged the Vatican's moral authority, even when disagreements arise. Early responses from Arab capitals suggested his words were welcomed as a gesture of respect for Palestinian suffering. In Israel, reactions were more muted. While officials did not issue a formal response immediately, analysts noted that references to forced removal are politically sensitive. Supporters of Israel argue that evacuations are necessary for military operations, while critics view them as part of a broader pattern of dispossession. By using such language, the Pope placed the Vatican at odds with official Israeli narratives, even if unintentionally. The Catholic Church has a long history of involvement in Middle Eastern affairs. Pope Paul VI was the first pontiff to visit the Holy Land in 1964. Pope John Paul II often spoke of Palestinian rights alongside Israel's right to security. More recently, Pope Francis visited the region and prayed at the separation wall in Bethlehem, a gesture that made headlines worldwide. Pope Leo XIV, however, has gone further in explicitly naming the repeated displacement of Gazans, reflecting perhaps his pastoral instinct to side with the marginalized and voiceless. Whether the Pope's appeal will influence the course of events remains uncertain. The conflict in Gaza has resisted countless diplomatic initiatives, and the suffering of its people has become a tragic constant in global news cycles. Yet, for those gathered in St. Peter's Square, the moment was not about geopolitics, but about conscience. As he concluded his address, the square erupted in applause, not the thunderous applause of celebration, but the solemn clapping of solidarity. Many in the crowd clasped hands, bowed their heads, and joined silently in the prayer he had invited them to share. The words of Pope Leo XIV lingered in the Roman air long after the audience dispersed. "I renew the call for a ceasefire, the release of hostages, a negotiated diplomatic solution, and full respect for international humanitarian law." It was both a prayer and a demand, one that history may judge as another attempt by a global moral leader to steer humanity back from the edge of destruction.